Welcome to Xianni, Renegade Immortal. Light novel author Ergen. Chapters 22 through 32. Audio read provided by Board Panda Cafe. Chapter 22, Scattering Technique. After returning to his room, he immediately closed the door. He didn't use the chi-gathering pills, but he kept them in his bag of holding. He was about to start an experiment with the stone bead. He cautiously took out the 3 gourds and the stone bead, then pondered a little and revealed an uncertain expression. He was weighing the pros and cons because, without the dew, his future cultivation speed would be very slow. But the mysterious clouds on the stone bead made Wang Lin very curious. After thinking for a while, he made his decision. He could always collect more dew, it would just take some time. However, if the 10th cloud appeared, it could cause a change to the bead. Maybe then, the water the bead soaks in will contain even more spiritual energy. After he thought about this, he immediately took out the gourd that contained the best morning dew. It took him a long time to get the jelly out of the gourd. After a while, all the dew had been poured out. There was half a stone bowl of greenish liquid containing a very refreshing fragrance. After smelling it, Wang Lin's body relaxed. He was afraid that the smell would attract the attention of the hidden experts in the sect, so he quickly threw the stone bead into it. After a few minutes, it absorbed a bit of the liquid. Wang Lin was a bit disappointed. He was hoping that there would be a sudden change. However, the stone bead was absorbing the scent from the liquid. Wang Lin pondered a bit, then put the stone bowl next to his bed. He sat down on his bed and started to cultivate. The 1 long and 3 short breathing techniques were now easy for Wang Lin. Although in the past 2 months, he hadn't condensed any spiritual energy, he had become used to the breathing technique. He would breathe like this even when he wasn't cultivating. The night passed, and Wang Lin opened his eyes to check on the stone bowl. He saw that half of the liquid had been absorbed by the stone bead. He was not discouraged and put the bowl back under his bed. After hesitating for a while, he took out a chi-gathering pill and put it in his mouth. He felt heat immediately come from within his body. In the month with Sun Dazu, he experienced this process every day. He quickly started cultivating. He cultivated until night came. Wang Lin slowly let out a white breath and smiled wryly. This chi-gathering pill is just like Sun Dazu's drugs that are made from herbs containing a lot of spiritual energy. Every time I eat them, my body feels relaxed and full of energy. I also don't feel hunger, but I still can't condense any spiritual energy, he sighed. Wang Chuo could achieve the first layer of chi condensation in 3 months. His expression remained the same, but he had mixed feelings in his heart. Talent is the most crucial part of cultivating, but with Wang Lin's personality, he wouldn't give up so easily. He had the mysterious bead. He wasn't lacking any spiritual energy. Although he couldn't condense any spiritual energy now, he would definitely succeed with time. Time. Wang Lin bit his lip and sighed. He took out the stone bowl from under his bed. There was only a little bit of liquid left, but the 10th cloud still hadn't appeared. He immediately took out another gourd and poured the liquid into the bowl. There was some extra liquid left over, so Wang Lin drank it and continued to cultivate. The heat that appeared in his body this time was stronger than all the previous times. He could feel the heat moving in his body. He suddenly felt very thirsty but continued to cultivate. After a short while, Wang Lin felt that something was wrong. The heat didn't dissipate like before but started to gather more and more as he breathed. He felt like his body was a balloon that had reached its limit. Wang Lin was afraid, so he stopped cultivating, but the pain of swelling stayed. He opened his eyes and immediately found out in horror that all his blood vessels were swollen like there were worms under his skin. Wang Lin didn't know that the drugs he ate before didn't generate much spiritual energy. Even with the spiritual energy he gathered from nature using the breathing technique, he couldn't make up for how much spiritual energy was lost due to his talent. Additionally, at the most critical moment, The chi scattering grass would prevent him from successfully condensing the spiritual energy. But now he drank the dew that contained much more spiritual energy than the drugs, much more than what he lost due to his talent. If he didn't cultivate, they would just dissipate after a while, but now, his spiritual energy would rise as if it were fire being fed by oil when he cultivated. He knew he messed up, but he didn't know what to do. He could only watch as his blood vessels expanded. When his blood vessels were at their limit, an idea entered his head. Without much time to think, he gritted his teeth and started to cultivate the 1 short and 3 long breathing technique. He thought that since 1 long 3 short was gathering spiritual energy, then the reverse must be scattering spiritual energy. Wang Lin's guess was more or less correct. Most cultivators knew this breathing technique because this was the step before foundation establishment. With his breathing, streams of spiritual energy exited from every part of his body. It was all absorbed by the stone bead under his bed. As time passed, the swollen feeling gradually lessened. His blood vessels also returned to normal. What was releasing from his body now was no longer spiritual energy but some dark chi that the stone bead didn't absorb that dissipated in the air. This lucky coincidence allowed Wang Lin to remove the chi scattering grass from his body. If one wanted to force out the chi scattering grass, one method was to use a lot of spiritual energy to force it all out. This was the method Sun Dezu was using, but he had a change of heart about Wang Lin and didn't want to lose any more of his herbs, so he gave up. The second method was to use the scattering technique, which was to remove all the spiritual energy from one's body and then start cultivating from the beginning. The reason Sun Dezu didn't use this method was because Wang Lin already had almost no spiritual energy, therefore, he couldn't even use the technique. The scattering technique lasted a whole day and night. Wang Lin was so tired he collapsed on his bed. He knew that he was able to save himself this time, but in the future, he mustn't carelessly drink the dew. He was incredibly exhausted, so he fell asleep. Chapter 23, 10th Cloud. After an unknown amount of time, Wang Lin opened his eyes and saw that it was dark outside. He got off his bed and stretched for a while. His body didn't feel very different. He took out the stone bowl from under his bed and was surprised to see that the 10th cloud had finally appeared on the bead. Wang Lin was thrilled. He looked at the bead and quickly ran out of the house. He went and gathered spring water before quickly returning. He placed the stone bead in the water and mixed it around. After he did all this, he drank the spring water and tasted it for a bit, but there wasn't any change like there was before. He looked at the bead with some disappointment on his face, then tried to bite it, but it was still hard as a rock. He even squeezed a drop of blood onto the bead, but there was still no change. He hesitated and gritted his teeth for a while, then took the stone bowl and slammed it on the stone bead. He believed that once it had 10 clouds, there would be some sort of change. After a bang, the stone bowl broke. Even Wang Lin's hand was numb, but there was no sign of damage to the stone bead at all. He used everything he could think of, but the stone bead didn't seem to have any change after obtaining the 10th cloud. Feeling heartbroken, he threw the stone bead to the side. After some time, he reluctantly walked over to pick it up. After staring at it for a while, he started to feel sleepy. He was stunned. He had just woken up, why would he feel sleepy? He rubbed his eyes and continued to stare at the bead. Slowly, he became even more drowsy. The bead became more and more blurry before he finally fell to the ground, asleep with the bead still in his hand. He had a dream. In his dream, he arrived at a space without boundaries. There were no stars, but there were glowing objects all around him. Although he was dreaming, his mind was very clear. He wondered why he would be dreaming of this. Wang Lin didn't feel like there was anything wrong with his body here. However, he didn't know how to wake up to escape this place. In his helplessness, he walked around aimlessly in this boundaryless area for a long time. After an unknown amount of time, when he was really tired, the surroundings started to shake. It felt like his body was being torn apart. With a scream, he opened his eyes. He looked around and noticed that he was still in his room. Wang Lin took a deep breath and wiped the sweat off his forehead. He was happy that the strange dream had finally ended. Suddenly, his expression became really odd. He looked at the bead and noticed that all the clouds had disappeared. Instead, there were little words inscribed on the bead. This. Wang Lin was stunned and quickly took a closer look. The words looked really strange, an uncommon font. He had always loved reading and thought for a long time, trying to patch the words with words he had read. He was able to guess a few words. Wang Lin held the bead and muttered to himself, "This seems to be a number in written form. It doesn't hold any meaning." Suddenly, a thought flashed through his head, and he remembered the strange dream. Was that related to the bead? Wang Lin pondered a little and immediately lay down on his bed, trying to force himself to fall asleep. But he was still full of energy, so he couldn't do it. He remembered that the last time he fell asleep was from staring at the bead. So, he started to stare at the bead without blinking once. Soon, he became drowsy and fell asleep. The boundaryless space appeared again. Wang Lin revealed a thoughtful look. This time, he didn't wander around but started to jump up and down repetitively. As time passed, he managed to jump higher and higher. At the start, he was only able to jump about half a meter, but now he was able to jump over 1 meter. After his entire body was worn out, the feeling of being torn apart appeared again. Then he woke up. The moment he woke up, he got off the bed and jumped. He jumped up really high, exactly like how he had jumped in his dream. Wang Lin was astonished. Soon, an excited expression appeared on his face. He took a few deep breaths to contain his excitement and began to pace around the room. His expression constantly changed. Sometimes, it was a puzzled expression, sometimes a deep thought expression, and sometimes a troubled expression. Sweat dripped from his forehead. Wang Lin muttered, "If it's just exercising in my dream, then it is useless. I can exercise in reality. It doesn't need to be in my dream. That's not right." This bead absorbed so much liquid filled with spiritual energy before the 10th cloud appeared. It can't be useless. There must be some other use, there must be. But what could it be? Wang Lin forgot about everything around him and wholeheartedly devoted himself to the bead. Could it be? He stopped. It seemed like he had grasped an idea. He asked himself, could it be time? After thinking about it, he couldn't control his emotions anymore. He wanted to excitedly scream a few words. He clenched his fists, and his body trembled as he looked at the bead. If it is really related to time, then I, Taiju, will become an immortal no matter how bad my talent is. Wang Lin took a few deep breaths before he returned to normal. Without saying a word, he took out the oil lamp and filled it with oil. He sat on his bed, holding the stone bead, and started to calculate time. After 5 hours, the lamp went out. Wang Lin quickly refilled the lamp with oil. He stared at the bead and went back into the dream. This time, he didn't practice jumping, but he sat cross-legged on the ground, counting time. 1 hour, 5 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, 35 hours, 50 hours. The feeling of his body being torn apart appeared again. When Wang Lin opened his eyes, the oil lamp was about to go out. 10 times the time. 10 times the time passed in the dream. Wang Lin excitedly stood up, holding the bead tightly. For the first time, he was confident in his cultivation. It was already really late. Wang Lin contained his excited heart and didn't immediately start to use the bead to start cultivating. He was afraid that if he started using the bead in the morning, he would be found out by someone. When that happened, he would not be able to keep it, so he put the bead back into his bag of holding and left the room. Chapter 24, Cultivation. After gathering a lot of spring water from the mountain, Wang Lin began to make spiritual energy-filled spring water. When it was 10 at night, he locked his door. As a precaution, he tied one end of a rope to the door and the other end to his arm so he would know right away if someone opened it. After drinking a few large gulps of spring water, he felt his body heat up. He then stared at the bead to enter the dream. In the endless dream space, Wang Lin sat cross-legged as he started to cultivate. When he was cultivating, the lights all around him became gentler. Wang Lin wasn't aware of this, but the lights entered his body. After staying there for a day, all the spiritual energy from the water was gone. But this time, he could clearly feel the difference in his body. Before, when he would finish Sun Dezu's medication, he felt heat. However, in the most critical moment, all the spiritual energy would scatter. But this time was different. Even though they still scattered, there was still a sliver left in his body. Although it was not a lot, Wang Lin gained a lot of confidence from those results. After considering it for a while, he couldn't figure out why it was different. So, in the end, he could only speculate that it was because of the mysterious stone bead. Because he couldn't leave the dream at his own will to get more spring water, he could only continue to cultivate for a long time. In the end, he realized that there was a difference between the dream space and the outside. Outside, even though he had been cultivating for more than a month, he would feel refreshed and very comfortable after cultivation. But here, after the spiritual energy from the spring water had all dissipated, he didn't have the refreshed and comfortable feeling. Instead, when he kept cultivating, he felt short of breath. After hesitating for a while, Wang Lin guessed that it was related to the existence of spiritual energy. There was no natural spiritual energy in the dream space. The more he thought, the more he felt he was correct. He frowned, thinking, if there was only a way to bring in the spring water from outside, it would be all good. Thinking about it, his heart suddenly skipped a beat as he looked at his own body and revealed a confused expression. Wang Lin was very puzzled by the red disciple uniform he had on. He quickly checked the pocket where his bag of holding was, and realized that it was missing. Clothes can appear in the dream space, but the bag of holding couldn't appear. He bitterly thought about it, and decided to experiment on what items could or couldn't be brought into the dream space once he left. Time passed by quickly. After 50 hours had passed, the feeling of being torn apart appeared and woke Wang Lin up. He still had a question in his heart. Why could he only stay in the dream for 5 hours? With that question in mind, he filled a gourd with spring water and carried it on his shoulder, ready to enter the dream again. But this time, no matter how he stared at the bead, he didn't feel the usual drowsiness. Wang Lin was frightened. After thinking for a long time, he contained the fear in his heart and sat down to cultivate. Gradually, as his breathing became steady, the natural spiritual energy was absorbed by his body. As it dissipated, some remained in his body. However, this was still far from the first layer of qi condensation. He spent the whole day cultivating. He kept drinking the spring water to keep his body filled with spiritual energy. In addition, he always held the stone bead, hoping to enter the dream space again, but failed to do so every time. Night arrived. He opened his eyes and could feel that the spiritual energy in his body had increased by a little. If it was normal, he would be very excited, but he was restless. He looked at the bead again and suddenly felt drowsy. Wang Lin revealed a happy expression as he looked away to expel the drowsiness. He stood up and rubbed his chin while pacing around the room, pondering over what had happened before and after he entered the dream. He finally found the problem. The first 2 times, he entered with almost no time in between. The third time was 5 hours after the second, and the fourth time was a whole day after the third. Following this logic, there were some restrictions on entering this dream space. To be safe, one should wait 5 hours after a use to guarantee entrance. After resolving that issue, Wang Lin began to prepare to test what he could bring into the dream space. He ended up gathering a lot of things, including 3 gourds. One was a gourd with some remaining dew, one was empty, and one was filled with spring water. He even put a piece of the broken stone bowl into his pocket. In addition, he took out a sweet potato and a cloth from his bag of holding and bound them to his body before entering the dream again. In the dream space, Wang Lin quickly checked his body. The sweet potato, broken stone bowl, and cloth were all there, but the 3 gourds and his bag of holding weren't. He concluded that, without a doubt, there was no spiritual energy within this dream realm, so any regular item, in other words, any item without any spiritual energy, could be brought in. The 3 gourds and the bag of holding all contained some spiritual energy, therefore, they couldn't be brought in. Letting out a sigh, Wang Lin began to think bitterly. He couldn't bring the gourd in there, and the few gulps he took from the gourd before going into the dream space weren't enough to last him the entire duration of his stay. After thinking about this, an idea flashed through his mind. He felt like he had an idea but couldn't grasp it. The feeling of an idea just outside of his reach made him go deep into his thoughts, organizing his ideas one by one. After a long time, his expression turned happy as he grasped one key point: the spiritual energy-filled water couldn't be brought in, but the spiritual energy that entered his body didn't disappear. It wasn't that you couldn't bring objects with spiritual energy in there, but if he thought carefully, he might find a way. After 50 hours had passed, he quickly left his room and searched the mountain until he found a few wild gourds and took them home. He believed that the 3 gourds from earlier couldn't be brought into the dream space because they had been soaked in the spiritual energy water for so long that the spiritual energy had fused with the gourds. Now, he was filling the freshly picked gourds with spiritual energy water. He might be able to trick the bead to bring them into the dream space. After 5 hours, Wang Lin entered the dream space with 4 gourds on his shoulder. After entering the dream, Wang Lin was surprised to find that all the gourds were still with him. He opened them and saw that the water was still inside. He took a drink and found them to still be filled with spiritual energy. Without a word, Wang Lin drank a few mouthfuls and started to cultivate. Every time the spiritual energy in his body dissipated, he drank more spring water. Soon, slivers of spiritual energy began to gather in his body, moving his body toward the first layer of qi condensation. The lights in the surrounding area started to silently enter his body again. With Wang Lin's talent, without the mysterious bead and the spiritual energy water, it would have been many years before he could achieve the first layer of qi condensation. Adding the qi scattering grass to the equation, it would take 30 to 50 years before he would succeed. Chapter 25, Qi Condensation. Time had flown by while he was in the Heng Yue sect. Wang Lin had been cultivating in the dream space for the past 2 months. He had thoroughly studied the capabilities of the stone bead. The dream space could be entered 3 times a day. Each time was about 50 hours, adding up to about 6 days. 2 months had passed in the real world, but he had cultivated for a whole year. Wang Lin couldn't feel it before, but cultivating was a very boring and dry process. With the help of the spiritual energy spring water, he didn't need to eat at all. All he did every day was cultivate. He repeated the long 3, short breathing technique as the spiritual energy entered his body. If it weren't for his parents' looks of hope that kept popping up in his mind, he believed that he wouldn't be able to stand this tedious cultivation. Especially when he thought about how Wang Chuo was able to reach the first layer of qi condensation in 3 months, Wang Lin would always feel dissatisfied in his heart. He almost never left his house. He was completely devoted to his cultivation. Wang Lin was the joke of the Heng Yue sect. Although there were many people who made fun of him, only a few paid any attention to him. Sun Dezu had almost forgotten about Wang Lin. Every time he thought of Wang Lin, he would become furious and do his best to filter those thoughts out of his mind. Thanks to all these factors, and with Wang Lin hiding his precious stone bead in his clothes before he fell asleep, these last 2 months passed by peacefully without anyone finding out about his stone bead. In those 2 months, the amount of times Wang Lin had consumed the spring water couldn't be counted anymore. In other words, whenever he felt he lacked spiritual energy, he would drink a few big gulps. If Sun Dezu knew of this, his heart would be filled with pain. He would likely kill this disciple with one slap. In the entire cultivation community in the country of Zhao, who else could cultivate like Wang Lin, drinking spiritual energy-filled spring water every day? Only a few old monsters of sects in the mainland could possibly have similar privileges. They would have to take over a mountain with an abundance of spiritual energy to achieve results similar to what the spiritual energy water brought Wang Lin. Spiritual energy held an important place in all cultivators' hearts. Although in the country of Zhao, there wasn't an abundance of spiritual energy, there was enough for the few sects that existed. If other cultivators knew of how Wang Lin was using spiritual energy, their hearts would ache to death. If Wang Lin's spiritual energy spring water was used to make immortal pills, it would increase the success rate. Although making immortal pills was all about the ingredients, a bit of extra spiritual energy could work wonders. With the help of the endless reservoir of spiritual energy contained within the bead, the quantity of spiritual energy in Wang Lin's body had increased more and more. Today, when Wang Lin was cultivating in the dream space, he could clearly feel the spiritual energy move within his body. With his breath, 2 long white dragons came from his nose. A feeling of ants crawling in his body arose. It felt as if water was washing every part of his body. The black liquid that smelled very bad excreted from his pores. Soon, the black liquid soaked his clothes. Wang Lin didn't care about it at all. He was currently in a wonderful state. It is as if he could see the spring water rushing inside him, while the spiritual energy slowly changed his body. After an unknown amount of time, Wang Lin opened his eyes. There was a light in his eyes that was never there before. His mind was clear, and his heart was as calm as water without a single ripple. His childhood flooded through his mind. His father's loving look when he was learning to talk, his mother's supporting words when he was studying all night, his parents' looks of expectation when he entered the Heng Yue sect, his relatives' ridiculing faces, and the villagers' admiring looks. He saw all of these things calmly as if he was a stranger. Much later, he took a deep breath. His heart felt bitter. When he stepped into the first layer of qi condensation, he gained a hint of understanding. According to the 3 stages of qi condensation, the first layer of qi condensation is like a gate. Once one opens the gate, they can enter the ranks of cultivators and would cut themselves off from the world, giving up worldly affairs. Everyone would experience this when they entered the first layer of qi condensation. He didn't know how others handled it, but he could cut off all worldly affairs except for his parents' love. With a sigh, Wang Lin dusted his shirt and stood up. With bright eyes, he looked around and could already feel that there was a difference in the dream space. Like before, he couldn't tell if there was anything weird with the glowing lights around him, but now he could feel spiritual energy moving within them. Even though he couldn't see the exact movement, compared to before, he was like a blind man who had become able to see. While watching, the feeling of being torn apart appeared again. Although there was still pain, it was much less and wouldn't result in cold sweat anymore. Wang Lin opened his eyes. He sat on his bed, thinking for a while, and suddenly opened the gourd. Looking inside, he could now see the spiritual energy that filled the spring water. He let out a smile. After reaching the first layer of qi condensation, he could feel the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. He took a deep breath. Wang Lin suddenly found that his body was sticky and let out a laugh. It was mentioned in the 3 stages of qi condensation that after reaching the first layer of qi condensation, the filth in the body would be expelled. It was a necessary stage for the body's transformation. Wang Lin opened his door. It was now afternoon outside. His steps were quick as he left through the east gate and arrived at a downstream location. He took off his clothes, and jumped into the river to wash his body. The dark filth was very greasy and took a long time to scrub off. After he finished washing, he lay down on a rock. He remembered a technique in the 3 stages of qi condensation, which introduced an immortal technique called the attraction force technique. This was considered one of the most basic immortal techniques and could be used as long as one had reached the first layer of qi condensation. The Heng Yue sect unified the country of Zhao 500 years ago. Although it had declined, it still contained many immortal techniques. Every disciple would be sent to the scripture library to choose one of many techniques, but most elders recommended the sword cultivation technique. The sword cultivation technique focused the entire cultivation on the sword. Although cultivation would be difficult in the future, it was very powerful early on and easy to control. The attraction force technique was the basis for controlling flying swords. Besides the attraction force technique, there were two other techniques recorded in the 3 stages of chi condensation. They were fireball and earth-splitting technique. Chapter 26, Malicious Thoughts. While thinking about the 3 techniques, Wang Lin became excited. In an attempt to produce the fireball technique, he formed the seal with his hand. However, forget about the fire, not even a spark appeared. After a long time, he frowned and tried again. Time and time again, he was ultimately met with failure. He only managed to produce a spark one time. Wang Lin laughed bitterly. Talent. It's always talent. He then practiced the earth-splitting technique on a nearby rock. Although the results were better than what he achieved while attempting the fireball technique, the crack was only the size of his pinky finger. This kind of technique was good for tricking mortals, but in a real battle, they were useless. Finally, he practiced the attraction force technique. He was still not satisfied with the result. But considering that the success rate of the attraction force technique was the highest, Wang Lin put all his effort into practicing the attraction force. To put it simply, the attraction force was really just controlling objects from a distance. If one can control the attraction force well and has reached the 2nd layer of chi condensation, they could practice the repelling technique. After one broke through the 3rd layer and went into the 4th layer, they could go to the sword spirit house to select a flying sword. After practicing for a long time, Wang Lin started to head home before it got dark. Now that he had reached the 1st layer of chi condensation, his eyesight and hearing had improved greatly. After entering through the east gate, he heard some familiar voices as he passed by the chore house. Brother Lu, when you first arranged for me to gather firewood, you said 100 pounds was enough to finish the task. Why is it 1,000 pounds now? I, Zhang Hu, am not new, and over these past few years, I have done much to please you. Do you really want to force me out of the sect? Zhang Hu, don't say that I'm making this hard on you. It is almost the end of the year, and even your brother here hasn't had a good time. But you, instead of working, have come here to give me a sob story. When I brought the firewood that you gathered to the pill house, I was scolded. I took them back and checked them. You little bastard, you really are smart. In the 100 pounds of wood, there was at least 30 pounds of water. Zhang Hu was furious. He loudly said, not possible. You're falsely accusing me. Isn't it because I saw Zhao Fu Gui give you an immortal talisman a few days ago so you could pick an easier task for him? What's the big deal? Among the honorary disciples, who doesn't know how you act? As for trying to force me out of the Heng Yue sect, you really fucked up, you bastard. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to tell the elders. Zhang Hu, you forced me to do this. If you want to blame someone, you can only blame yourself for being unlucky to have seen something you shouldn't have. Zhang Hu, stay here. If the elders know of this, your entire family could die with you. Disciple Lu's cold voice came out of the room, and Zhang Hu let out a scream. After hearing it, Wang Lin was surprised and kicked open the door. Wang Lin first saw the youth named Lu's hideous face. He was in the middle of thrusting a dagger toward Zhang Hu, who had a frightened expression and whose body was against the wall. Wang Lin saw that he didn't have enough time to help Zhang Hu. He quickly started to use the attraction force technique. Luckily, it was successful this time. An invisible hand held down the attacker. However, the dagger had already pierced Zhang Hu's chest. Blood poured out from the wound. The youth named Lu was extremely frightened. His whole body felt powerless as an invisible force held his body, preventing the dagger from being pushed down anymore. Zhang Hu's face was pale, Sweat covered his forehead. He looked at Wang Lin and quickly crawled to the side. The youth named Lu was shocked and immediately started to struggle. Wang Lin's forehead started to sweat hard, as if he was starting to lose control. This was the first time Wang Lin used the technique on a person, so obviously, he couldn't control it well. Adding on to that, the person was struggling, so he had difficulty maintaining control. Wang Lin's body trembled. Seeing that Zhang Hu wasn't in danger anymore, he relaxed a bit, and the attraction force technique also loosened up. Seeing that Lu was about to struggle free, Zhang Hu revealed a strange expression. He looked at Wang Lin, then at Brother Lu. His expression turned ruthless. He picked up a wood-cutting axe and walked toward Brother Lu. Brother Lu's face was filled with fear, and he struggled harder. Zhang Hu gritted his teeth and muttered to himself, "Not a man without poison. Brother Lu, you forced me to do this. You wanted to kill my whole family. Zhang Hu, what are you going to do?" Wang Lin was surprised, and the attraction force technique lost its effect. The moment the youth named Lu regained control of his body, Zhang Hu slammed down the axe toward Brother Lu's head. Brother Lu was too late to dodge. A sound like that of a watermelon being split filled the room momentarily. Brother Lu's body twitched on the ground before it stopped moving. The axe in Zhang Hu's hand fell to the ground. He looked at the bloody corpse with a complex expression. Wang Lin was stunned. This was the first time he had seen such a bloody scene. After a long time, he bitterly started to ask, "Zhang Hu. You?" Zhang Hu looked up at Wang Lin. His face looked distorted, revealing a grim look. He said, word for word, "Wang Lin, you saw as well. I didn't want to kill him. If it wasn't for you, I would have been killed by him. He forced me to do all that. He forced me." Wang Lin remained silent. He hadn't expected this to happen. Zhang Hu took a deep breath. His face revealed a determined expression. He walked next to the corpse and searched it for a while. He took out a bag of holding containing hundreds of the talismans that honorary disciples used to visit their families. In addition to those, there was a thread-bound booklet. Zhang Hu glanced through the book and put it away in his clothes. Afterward, he searched the room. He eventually found a secret compartment under the bed. Inside it was a piece of yellow paper. Pondering a little, he turned toward Wang Lin and said, "Wang Lin, today you saved me. I, Zhang Hu, will always remember this. As for the Heng Yue sect, I won't be able to stay any longer. When the sect finds disciple Lu's body, they will investigate and find me in the end. I'm going to take these things. As for this disaster-causing immortal talisman, it must be a treasure, or else this youth named Lu wouldn't have tried to kill me." With that, he handed the yellow paper to Wang Lin. Wang Lin didn't take it. He let out a sigh and bitterly smiled. "You. Why must you do this? If you hadn't killed him." Zhang Hu frowned. He said, "Wang Lin, don't talk about this anymore. I have suffered enough in these past few years. If you still consider me a friend, take this immortal talisman." Wang Lin bitterly took the talisman. He didn't say any more. "Wang Lin, I'm going to leave. This has nothing to do with you. If the sect investigates, they will only find me. By then, I will have already left the Heng Yue sect. Humph, the country of Zhao is very large. I don't believe I'll be an honorary disciple my whole life." Zhang Hu's expression was complex. After a long time, he slowly turned and left the room. Chapter 27, Visit. Wang Lin stared at the spot Zhang Hu had just been standing in. After a long time, he let out a sigh while holding the yellow paper in his hand. Zhang Hu was his first friend after coming to the Heng Yue sect, but now this happened. This immortal talisman is the cause of this disaster. Wang Lin stared at the talisman. His eyes suddenly changed as he noticed what was different about it. Although this yellow talisman looked just like the talisman disciples get when they go to visit their families, the amount of spiritual energy in it was much higher than the other ones. In addition, there was a sense of danger coming from the talisman. Wang Lin was surprised. Although he didn't know what it was, he knew that it was a treasure. Hesitating slightly, Wang Lin put away the yellow paper. Looking at the corpse on the ground, he let out a sigh. If this corpse wasn't taken care of, with Jiang Hu's speed, he wouldn't be able to escape the sect. Luckily, there was enough room in the bag of holding to hold the corpse. Wang Lin then organized the room and wiped away the blood. He quietly went into the mountain and disposed of the body, then carefully made his way back to his room. After lamenting about what happened, he decided not to think about Jiang Hu anymore. He took out the immortal talisman, and began to study it. On the first look, the talisman looked exactly like the ones disciples used when visiting home, but upon closer inspection, one could tell from the material and the ink that it was vastly superior to the talisman disciples used to go home. Wang Lin squeezed the immortal talisman. He pondered a little. He wasn't sure of the exact usage of this talisman. Since the day that he had almost died from drinking the dew, he had been very careful about things belonging to immortals. He didn't dare to carelessly use them. Plus, the characters on the talisman revealed a hint of danger, causing him to be even more cautious. After hesitating for a bit, he put away the talisman. He decided to study it later. After doing all this, he took out the mysterious bead and entered the dream space. This time, he didn't focus all his time on cultivation but spent some time learning the attraction force technique. After using it on Brother Lu, he felt that it was very useful. That was why he was so determined to practice it. He first used the gourd as a target. He tried using the attraction force to grab the gourd. After numerous tries, he finally succeeded. He immediately stopped using the attraction force and started from the beginning. Wang Lin's thought process was very simple. He felt that he must be able to freely use the attraction force. If he tried to use it 10 times, it must succeed 10 times or else, no matter how strong it was, it couldn't be used in key moments. He calculated a bit. Given his current condition, he could succeed 3 out of 10 times. With only 4 successes so far, it was far from measuring up to his standards. The time spent in the dream space flew by. Without Wang Lin realizing, the feeling of being torn apart came. After coming back to reality, he wasted no time at all. As he opened his eyes, he drank more spring water and started cultivating. When there was sufficient spiritual energy in his body, he took a deep breath as the contents of the 3 stages of qi condensation appeared in his head. Aside from the laws for each of the 3 stages of qi condensation, there were also 2 very important chants. These chants were the real core of qi condensation. There are 15 layers of qi condensation. Unlike the first layer, which one could obtain by themselves, all the other 14 layers required a chant to enter the next layer. For example, if he had already completed the first layer and even mastered the second layer's cultivation method, he could only stay in the first layer if he didn't succeed in the second layer's chant. Wang Lin muttered the chant in his mind. The spiritual energy in his body started to change. At first, the change was small, but soon, it felt like boiling water was flowing through his body. It seemed that there wasn't enough spiritual energy as it intermittently spread throughout his body, causing soreness, numbness, itchiness, pain, and other effects all over his body. He also had an illusion that his body was full of holes. All of this was caused by the spiritual energy. There was a very prominent line in the 3 stages of qi condensation: the opening chant for each layer won't always succeed. Talent, spiritual energy, and chance all played key roles. Some people would be able to succeed in 1 try, while some people would need tens or hundreds of tries. After a long time, the feeling in his body slowly dissipated. Wang Lin was covered in sweat, and the spiritual energy in his body was all gone. But Wang Lin knew from the book that the lack of spiritual energy was only temporary, and would recover after meditating for a while. He failed to open the second layer, but Wang Lin was not discouraged. This time, he was just testing it out. It just means that he didn't have enough spiritual energy at that moment to enter the second layer. After all, he had just achieved the first layer. There was no rush. He still had the spring water with him, so he could just cultivate until he reached the limit of the first layer before attempting to reach the second layer again. That would increase his chances greatly. With this plan, Wang Lin started to cultivate night and day. The spiritual energy in his body started to slowly accumulate, and his mastery of the attraction force technique also improved. He tried the chant for the second layer many times, but they all ended in failure. In reality, half a month had passed, but 3 months had passed in the dream space. Today, Wang Lin was cultivating, waiting for the time to enter the dream space again. He saw that it was still early. He hesitated a bit, then started the chant for the second layer to experience it again. He couldn't even remember how many times he had experienced it. Every time, it ended with him being exhausted and all the spiritual energy in his body gone without success. 2 hours later, Wang Lin raised his head. He was worn out again, and all his spiritual energy was gone from his body. He muttered to himself with a wry smile, failed again. Entering the second layer is too hard. Suddenly, his eyes darted toward the door. A cold voice came through the door. "Apprentice Brother Wang, come out to see me." The voice sounded familiar. Wang Lin got up and opened the door to see a 27 or 28-year-old youth in black standing outside with a cold air about him. Black clothes. Wang Lin's heart tightened. He recognized that he was the same person that brought him, Wang Chuo, and Wang Hao to the Heng Yue sect, and also the person who brought his father to find him near the cliff. Wang Lin remembered that he was wearing white clothes back then. However, in just these few short months, he has now risen to black clothes. He suddenly remembered the day when they were testing at the foot of the mountain. The person who took Wang Hao as a helper said that the man in front of Wang Lin had now reached a critical point in their cultivation and took over as the examiner to avoid distracting him. Chapter 28, Chores. Among purple, black, white, and red, black represented a really high cultivation. Wang Lin couldn't see through his cultivation, so he respectfully said, "Wang Lin greets Brother Jiang. Congratulations to Senior on reaching black clothes." The black-clad youth looked at Wang Lin and slowly said, "Me successfully breaking into the 5th layer of qi condensation does relate a bit to you. I wouldn't have broken through so quickly if I hadn't found that cave while looking for you." Wang Lin was stunned and asked, "Brother Jiang, that hole with the suction force in the cave could help cultivation?" The black-clad youth nodded and said, "When you reach the peak of the 4th layer and need to use the chant to enter the 5th layer, go there yourself, and you will see the effect." He glanced at Wang Lin and said, "Brother Wang, it can't be helped since your talent is mediocre, but since you are a disciple now, you must cultivate diligently. I see that you have no spiritual energy in you at all. You haven't even reached the 1st layer of qi condensation. I'm afraid you are the only one out of all the inner disciples." Wang Lin was stunned but wryly smiled, "I'll take apprentice brother's advice to heart. I will double my effort in cultivation." He suddenly changed the subject and asked, "Brother Jiang, what is the reason you're here today?" The black-clad youth chuckled and said, "It's nothing serious. The honorary disciple in charge of the Chaw house disappeared. Someone saw you go there that day, so I came here to ask you about it." Wang Lin's expression remained normal and laughed, "I have a vague idea of what happened. Normally, I don't go near the Chaw house, but half a month ago, I passed by it, and honorary disciple was talking behind my back, so I taught him a lesson. Maybe he got scared of me and left the sect." Brother Jiang nodded his head, half laughing. He looked at Wang Lin and said, "A disgusting honorary disciple is not important. Today, I came to you because the elders have decided that an honorary disciple shouldn't be in charge of the Chaw house, so they wanted an inner disciple to take over. But no inner disciple wants to go, they are all busy cultivating." Wang Lin wryly smiled, "I understand. It seems the task has been assigned to me. Brother Jiang smiled slightly and said, pack your things and head there today. Right now, the chore house is really messy. You have to get it back in order. He cusped his hands at Wang Lin, took a step, and a sword appeared under his feet. The sword emitted rainbow colors as he rode it away. Wang Lin revealed a frustrated expression. He didn't want to go to the chore house. The people there were too nosy, it would be too easy for his secret to be exposed. Also, there would be a lot of work that would disrupt his cultivation. But now, he had to go. With a belly full of anger, he packed his things and arrived at the chore house. After arriving there, he reached a decision in his heart. He couldn't stay in the chore house for too long. He had to mess up everything in the chore house so that every honorary disciple would go to the elders to ask for a replacement. With this idea in mind, Wang Lin cleaned up disciple Lu's room. Besides the bed and the table, everything that was useless was thrown outside. While he was doing this, a few disciples arrived at the chore house. They had learned that Wang Lin was now in charge of assigning chores, so many of them were nervous. The faces of the few that ridiculed Wang Lin the most were pale, and their hearts pounded. Some had intentions of helping Wang Lin clean up, but after being glared at, they all obediently stood in the yard. After he finished cleaning, Wang Lin casually sat down on a chair. He coldly looked at the 100+ honorary disciples before him. He knew that the Heng Yue sect had a lot of honorary disciples. This was only a fraction of them. In the next few days, there would be more honorary disciples coming back to report on their work. You will now chop 500 pounds of firewood. Wang Lin casually pointed at a person. He remembered that that person had secretly ridiculed him. That person was stunned. He immediately cried, Brother Wang, I used to work in the kitchen. I don't know how to chop wood. Wang Lin rolled his eyes. He snorted, now it's 1,000 pounds a day. The boy suddenly kneeled to the ground and started crying. Brother Wang, you are a good person. I shouldn't have ridiculed you back then. But please, don't be so vindictive. I can't possibly do 1,000 pounds, how about 500 pounds? The surrounding people all looked at each other. They all knew Wang Lin would make things difficult, but this was clearly revenge. There were a few honorary disciples in the crowd who shouted in discontent. Everyone, don't listen to him. Let's go find an elder and have them carry out justice. Wang Lin is too overbearing. Correct? Let us go find the elders to get another inner disciple to be in charge of this place. If they don't listen to us, we will kneel and never get up. True. Let's go, everyone? Don't stay here. This Wang Lin has a villainous look. He doesn't even remember that he entered the sect by trying to commit suicide. Such a disgrace. The sound of the dissatisfied voices grew louder and louder. Soon, everyone left the yard while shouting insults. They all had looks of grievance as they went toward the courtyard, all shouting things like, Wang Lin doesn't want us to live anymore. Wang Lin was relaxed in his heart. He didn't stop them and hoped that they would succeed. This way, the elders would get mad and make someone else take over so he could concentrate on cultivation. The remaining 10 or so people were hesitating. They wanted to leave, but if this thing failed, wouldn't it mean that they had completely disrespected Wang Lin? Wang Lin wasn't in a rush. He waited for the result from the main courtyard. A moment later, all the honorary disciples gloomily returned, one by one. This time, they were no longer shouting but had eyes filled with despair and silence. Wang Lin saw their expressions and knew that they had failed. He was very disappointed in his heart. It seemed he had to make an even bigger commotion. Thinking about it, he scanned the people here and said, all of you who secretly mocked me, listen to me. I am here today to get revenge. If you're dissatisfied, go to the elders. If you can get me removed from this position, I must thank you. One of the disciples begged, Brother Wang, you are a great person. Please forgive us. Yes, Brother Wang, we were blind back then. Please give us a break. I'll kowtow to you. Brother Wang, they all mocked you back then, but I never did. I even defended you. Chapter 29, Locked Door. Without waiting for that person to finish, someone on the side angrily said, Zhao Xiao back then, you mocked him the loudest. Brother Wang, don't listen to him. Zhao Xiao's expression changed. He angrily said, Zhao Xiao-san, I am your older brother, you backstabbing bastard. Go back to your room and see how I'm going to beat you up. I'm loyal, Brother Wang. You're a kind person, please give me some easier work. Brother Wang, don't listen to those two brothers. They are known for this two-man act. Who knows how many honorary disciples they cheated? Apprentice brother, I'm the person who has never said a bad thing about you. A very pretty female honorary disciple delicately said, Brother Wang, this apprentice sister has always had a weak body and can't do any hard labor. How about I come and give you a massage every night? Is that okay? There weren't many female disciples among the honorary disciples of the Heng Yue sect. Only about 10% were female. After all, males had a better chance in the test of perseverance. The few female honorary disciples were, of course, well received by everyone. Based on their looks, some even got favored by inner disciples. Then, another female honorary disciple threw a pretty look at Wang Lin and flirtatiously said, Apprentice brother, Brother Lu never gave me any hard work, I only ever came to serve him at night. I know a few other apprentice sisters. I'll take them to see you tonight, okay? Everyone was desperately trying to tell Wang Lin that they had never said anything bad about him. After listening for a very long time, Wang Lin ran out of patience and shouted, all of you, shut up. What a mess this is. After he finished speaking, he pointed at a person and said, you, 20 vats of water. If you're unhappy, go to the elders. That person's body quivered. He opened his mouth to talk but saw the impatience in Wang Lin's eyes. He immediately smiled and nodded his head. You wash 500 kilograms of clothes every day. Remember, if you're dissatisfied, go find the elders. The person who was pointed at swallowed hard and almost passed out. He muttered, 500 kilograms, that's like all the clothes in the sect added together. You, clean the whole sect. Same thing, if you're dissatisfied, go find the elders. You, clear the outhouses. If I see one fly in there, you can live in there. You, go gather 500 pounds of herbs a day. If you mix weeds in there to trick me, I'll kick you out of the sect. All of you listen, if you're dissatisfied, go find the elders. For some, while the workload was hard, it was still bearable. However, for the last few he pointed at, their legs grew soft and immediately collapsed on the ground. All the honorary disciples wore pitiful expressions. The entire Heng Yue sect might not even have 500 kilograms of herbs in the mountains. Based on Wang Lin's memories of the people that had mocked him, he pointed at them one by one and carefully thought about what jobs to give them. He wasn't tired at all and finally finished assigning all the work. He lounged around for a while and thought that the chores that he assigned were impossible to finish. What could the honorary disciples do other than go complain to the elders? But just in case the elders decide not to do anything, it'd be better to make this mess even bigger, to let them know that it was a big mistake to make me, Wang Lin, in charge of the chore house. Thinking about it, he pointed at someone he didn't know and said, you're in luck. Your job is to keep track of everything. Make a list of all the gifts given to me. Record their names and the time of the gift. If you try to be greedy, I'll kick you out of the sect. That person was so surprised he immediately fell to the ground and kowtowed to Wang Lin. He repeatedly said that he would remember to do it correctly and not make a mistake. All the honorary disciples were dumbfounded. Before, Disciple Lu was secretive about it, but this Wang Lin was boldly asking for bribes. A moment later, an honorary disciple stepped forward and took out 3 talismans used for visiting home. He presented them to Wang Lin and said, "Brother Wang, this is me paying my respects to you." Wang Lin replied with a sound. He put the talismans away and asked, "What job were you assigned earlier?" "Gather 20 vats of water a day." The person nervously replied. Wang Lin slowly said, "Then, do 5 vats a day instead." That person was surprised and immediately expressed his thanks. Following that person's lead, everyone else got up and was about to step forward when Wang Lin slowly stood up and said, "All of you leave. You all need to follow the proper process of giving gifts. Write down your current job and your desired job on a piece of paper, then send it to the person I appointed to manage this. You can only do it only once in 10 days. After he finished, he returned to his room and closed the door. The people in the yard were sighing. Some even had anger in their eyes. Their stomachs were full of curses directed at Wang Lin, but none of them said them out loud. They all dispersed with long faces. After they left, Wang Lin came out of the room and explored the entire chore house. He found a remote door to a storage room. The storage room was not large. After Wang Lin cleaned it up, although he was disappointed, this was the most secluded place here. He cleaned up to make some space, locked the door, and entered the dream space. Time flew by. Wang Lin had already been in charge of the chore house for 2 months. In those 2 months, besides assigning jobs to the honorary disciples for the first few days, he focused on his cultivation for the rest of the time. As for the chores of the honorary disciples, he didn't care at all. If they didn't do their jobs, all he had to do was snort coldly, and they would offer him gifts. Wang Lin was very annoyed during those 2 months. His cultivation was constantly getting interrupted by the honorary disciples. He didn't know what the other inner disciples and elders were thinking. He messed things up this much, but they still hadn't sent a replacement. Chapter 30, Wang Hao. Do I need to be even more unreasonable? To leave the chore house, Wang Lin was ready to go all out. He really wanted to see what the limits of the elders were. Privately, among the honorary disciples, besides the 2 words trash and shameless, he gained another title, the Black-Hearted King. Compared to Disciple Lu's nickname, Weasel, it was on a whole different level. After Wang Lin had practiced for a year in the dream space, the spiritual energy in his body had increased many folds. He had reached the limit of the first layer. No matter how much he cultivated, his spiritual energy no longer increased. Thus, one night, he started to try the chant to enter the second layer. After failing so many times, his hard work wasn't a waste as he finally broke into the second layer. The pores on his body were oozing black grease. After washing himself, Wang Lin looked at himself and saw that his eyes were like lightning. He looked very different from before. He rubbed his chin and thought, there is only the chant for the third layer left. If I go back to Sun Dezu to ask for the chants for the later layers and he finds out I've reached the second layer, he will definitely question me about how it happened. If I can't properly explain it, then it will bring me a lot of trouble. After thinking for a while, Wang Lin still couldn't think of a good idea. He couldn't help but frown. With a sigh, Wang Lin began to practice the attraction force technique. After this year's time of practice, Wang Lin could now succeed 10 out of 10 times. Since he reached his current degree, he decided to try something harder. He found a large rock in the chore house and began to practice. Another month had passed. What Wang Lin had done at the chore house caused all the honorary disciples to complain non-stop. It was winter time, and the sect started to prepare for the yearly inner disciple competition. This year was the Heng Yue sect's honorary disciple competition, which happens every 10 years. If one ranked in the top 3, they would become an inner disciple. All the honorary disciples were polishing their fighting skills and secretly plotting. Therefore, things related to the chore house were delayed as everyone was too busy. Wang Lin was very disappointed that he was still in charge of the chore house. As for the inner disciple competition, he didn't plan to participate. If he had the time, why not spend it cultivating in the dream space instead? Today, it started to snow on the Hengyue mountain. From a distance, it seemed like a land of snow. Wang Lin wasn't cultivating but stood quietly in the yard. The attraction force technique activated as if there was a giant hand moving around, pushing away all the snow so none would land on him. Looking toward where his home was, he remembered that his parents would have the stove burning to keep the house warm around this time of year. He would sit next to the stove reading. Dad would be on the side carving, and Mom would be storing pickled vegetables. Sometimes, he'd be tired from reading and sit next to his dad, watching him carve. When he was in high spirits, he would go and help his dad. There was a lot of joy between them. Wang Lin remembered that under his bed were some wooden toys. He would sometimes take them out and play with them on the ice with the neighborhood kids. Thinking about all this, Wang Lin took a deep breath. A cultivator needs to sever all mortal ties, and all of these were thoughts that would disrupt cultivation. Wang Lin closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his mind was clear. He couldn't sever all his mortal connections, so he hid them deep in his heart. While he was reminiscing, his expression suddenly changed. He was now in the second layer of chi condensation and had awakened his ability of divine sense. All of this was described in the 3 layers of chi condensation book. With a scan of his divine sense, he noticed that Wang Hao was coming in his direction. A moment later, the door opened. Wang Hao walked in, wearing a leather cap and leather coat. He looked at Wang Lin, surprised, and said, "Brother Taiju, aren't you cold? Wearing this little and still standing outside?" Wang Lin chuckled, "I calculated that you would come and see me, so I came out to welcome you, you little rascal." He didn't feel cold at all. After reaching the second layer of chi condensation, he noticed that his body was a lot stronger than before. Wang Hao chuckled. He walked in and carefully looked at Wang Lin and said, "Brother Taiju, how come I feel you're a bit different from a few months ago?" Wang Lin said, "That's natural. I have reached the second layer of chi condensation and can be considered an immortal." Wang Hao's mouth twitched. He went into the room and said, "Don't boast. Our talents are at about the same level. I have received help from immortal pills and still haven't reached the first layer. But for you to reach the second layer? Impossible." Wang Lin didn't try to clarify. Sometimes, when he told the truth, people wouldn't even believe him, and if he lied, then he might end up causing others to be suspicious. In the end, his relationship with Wang Hao wasn't deep. Better to be on guard. To trust someone at first sight was not something Wang Lin was capable of. "Wang Hao, how come you have time to visit me today? Is the pill house not busy?" Wang Lin returned to the room and poured Wang Hao a cup of hot water. Wang Hao took the hot water and blew it a few times before taking a sip. He smiled. "You haven't gone to the pill house to pick up your things in the past few months. I've been saving your portion and came to deliver it to you today." As he was talking, he took out a small package and put it on the table. Wang Lin revealed a faint smile. He didn't even look at the package but looked at Wang Hao. He didn't believe Wang Hao only came to deliver a package. Wang Hao was embarrassed after being stared at and said, "Brother Taiju, I heard you've been doing pretty well at the chore house these past few months." Wang Lin poured himself some water. He took a sip and said, "Wang Hao, just say what you need to say. If I can help, I definitely will." Wang Hao's expression was awkward. He moved closer and mysteriously said, "Brother Taiju, I always knew you were a smart person. Speaking honestly, I know you have a lot of the talismans the honorary disciples use to visit home. Can you lend me some?" Chapter 31, Snow Water. Wang Lin's expression remained normal. He asked, "How much do you need?" Wang Hao hesitated and said, "At least 200. That much? What do you need it for?" Wang Lin was stunned. He did have 200 talismans. He had received almost 500 from bribes. Wang Hao sighed and said, with a bitter face, Brother Taizhu, in 2 months, it will be the inner disciple competition. While I can participate, I don't have any chance of winning. But I refuse to give up. That bastard Wang Chuo has already reached the first layer of qi condensation, and I heard that he is attempting to reach the second layer. How does he cultivate so quickly? Wang Lin hadn't seen Wang Chuo in a while and was quite surprised. It seemed that talent really mattered. Wang Hao revealed an angry expression and said, it's only because he has a good master. His master didn't care about the price and begged my master for a batch of foundation establishment pills. Those are very precious pills within the sect. After eating the pill, cultivation speed increases greatly. Wang Lin nodded and asked, what does this have to do with you borrowing talismans? Wang Hao muttered, of course there is a connection. You don't interact with others much, but a month before the competition, all the inner disciples will hold a small exchange. There, everyone takes out their treasures to exchange for the final preparation. I heard from some seniors that attended it before. They said that during the exchange, anything can be used, like flying swords, magical treasures, pills, etc. After Wang Lin heard this, his heart started pounding. He didn't have much interest in flying swords or magical treasures, but the chance for the qi condensation stages were important to him. Thinking that he might be able to obtain them at the exchange, he pondered for a while and said, the inner disciples trust each other that much to just do these exchanges. Wang Hao laughed and said, Brother Taizhu, you have asked an important question. There is one rule during this exchange, and that's also the requirement to enter the exchange. That is, have a disguise pill. After taking the disguise pill, unless someone is at the foundation stage, no one can recognize you. A thought flashed through Wang Lin's head. You are borrowing all these talismans for that pill. Wang Hao was stunned. He nodded and said, Brother Taizhu is really smart. That is true. This pill is controlled by my master, and around this time of year, he starts to sell them privately. The price is 200 talismans. Wang Lin considered a bit and said, this exchange seems quite interesting. I want to go check it out as well. Wang Hao quickly said, sure, as long as you have a disguise pill, you can attend. My goal this time is a foundation establishment pill. I heard that this time, there is a disciple selling them. Wang Lin waved his right hand and took out 400 talismans from his bag of holding. He made them into 4 bundles of 100 talismans each. Wang Hao's eyes lit up, then stored them in his bag of holding. Brother Taizhu, there is still about half a month of time. I'll come and find you then. We can go together. Wang Lin nodded. They talked for a while, and Wang Hao left. After Wang Hao left, he contemplated it for a while. Wang Lin attached great importance to this exchange, as this was a chance for him to get the chance for the later qi condensation stages. But he didn't have anything valuable, and all the talismans were used to buy the disguise pill. After pondering for a long time, he decided to bring some spiritual energy-filled spring water. That should be able to attract some people. With the help of the pill, no one would know his identity. After making up his mind, Wang Lin no longer thought about this matter. Right now, he couldn't enter the dream space, so he started to practice the attraction force technique on the large rocks in the Chaw house. He had already practiced the attraction force over 10,000 times in the dream space. He had become more and more skilled at it. If it was used on a gourd, then the success rate was 10 out of 10. Now, in everyday life, as long as he moves his hand, he can grab small objects. If the size was too big, the success rate would lower, but with his spiritual energy still growing, and after he entered the second layer, the attraction force technique was starting to show its true power. After practicing on the large rocks for a few hours, it was dark and snowing outside, but Wang Lin didn't immediately enter the dream space. He stood at the doorway and stared at the snowflakes as he started to ponder. Throughout the month, while cultivating at the second layer, Wang Lin noticed a problem. The effects of the spiritual energy-filled spring water had decreased. Although the decrease was very small and could be made up, it brought him endless worry. He was afraid that, as his qi condensation stage got higher and higher, one day, the spiritual energy-filled spring water would lose its effect. While soaking the mysterious bead in liquid dew was the best, followed by spring water, dew collection was far too slow. There was not enough to use, and there was none in the winter. The spring water was the easiest and most practical to get, and he had an endless supply. However, if one day, the spring water was no longer effective, Wang Lin needed to have something to replace it. He slightly moved his hand and activated the attraction force technique. Chunks of snow formed into a dragon and charged into a large pot in the room. After a short while, Wang Lin had filled half the pot. He stopped the attraction force technique, and arrived next to the pot. He formed a seal with his right hand. After more than 10 tries, he finally formed a baby-sized fireball. The fireball emitted a lot of heat and quickly melted the snow. After all of the snow had melted, he wiped the sweat off his forehead. Continuously using 2 techniques had made him very tired. There wasn't much snow water in the pot. He threw the mysterious bead into the pot and took it out 10 minutes later. He now had a very good understanding of the mysterious bead. Soaking it in spring water for 10 minutes was the limit. He had tested soaking it for longer but found that as long as it was in for at least 10 minutes, the effect remained the same. He took a drink of the water, then closed his eyes and carefully examined the change in the spiritual energy in his body. A moment later, he opened his eyes and muttered, "The effect is a lot better than spring water but still below dew. It can be used?" He immediately took out countless gourds. They were all the gourds that he had gathered in the mountains. After working for the entire night, all the snow in his yard was gone. That snow filled up a small portion of the gourds with spiritual energy water. Chapter 32, Exchange. In the next few days, besides training in the dream space, Wang Lin had been busy collecting snow to melt for water. If not for the fear of the spiritual energy escaping, he would have used vats, so he used gourds instead. It was good that he had enough gourds. After only a few days, he had accumulated a few hundred gourds filled with snow water. He calculated that the snow water that he had collected in those gourds was enough for him to use in the dream space for a long time. After storing the snow water, Wang Lin went back to cultivating. Although the effect of spring water had dropped, it was still useful. In the blink of an eye, 10 days had passed. Over those 10 days, Wang Lin had drunk more spring water than he ever had before. It was a good thing the spring water dissolved into spiritual energy in his body. Otherwise, there was no way his stomach could handle that much water. The amount of spiritual energy needed for the second layer was much greater than the first layer. In fact, Wang Lin had already cultivated for more than 9 months in his dream space. If it were the first layer, after cultivating for 9 months with this much spiritual energy, he would have achieved some good results. However, now, even though he felt that his body contained much more spiritual energy, he still wasn't able to reach the results he desired. The day that Wang Lin agreed to meet with Wang Hao had come, so Wang Lin didn't enter the dream space. Around midnight, it started to snow, and Wang Hao entered Wang Lin's divine sense. Shortly after, Wang Hao opened the door but didn't come in. He quickly said, "Master took a long time to refine pills and delayed me. Come quickly, the exchange is about to start." Wang Hao hurried toward the exchange, and Wang Lin hastily followed. The two walked in the snow and wandered out of the sect's courtyards and into the mountains. The current road was very slippery, so Wang Hao walked very slowly. His body was shaking. He whispered, "What's with this damn weather? If I fall down the mountain here and die, even if I were a ghost, I would want some justice." Wang Lin's body was now very light. He didn't share Wang Hao's discomfort at all. In fact, he felt that the weather was pretty good. He thought that, after the exchange was over, he could collect a lot more snow water. After walking for a while, Wang Hao stopped. He secretly handed Wang Lin a green pill and whispered, "We are almost there. I came here a few days ago. It's only a few turns away. Let us take the pill now so no one will know our identities." Wang Hao took out a similar pill and swallowed it. A thick black fog appeared and covered Wang Hao's body. A gruff voice came out from the fog and said, "How is it? Can you tell who I am?" Wang Lin scanned Wang Hao with his divine sense and found that he felt as if there was a barrier of mud blocking him. That made him feel like the pill was safe to take. He laughed and said, "This pill is really amazing." Then, he took the pill, and a similar thing happened to him as well. The two quickly walked forward. After making a few turns, they arrived at an open area. The open space was very large. Dozens of people stood there, covered in black fog like them, in silence. After Wang Lin and Wang Hao arrived, they found an empty space and stood there without moving. Not long after, seeing that no one else was coming, one person stepped forward, coughed once, then hoarsely said, "Time is up. This time, I will host the exchange again. Just as before, I'll go first." After he finished talking, he pulled out a little silver sword and said, "This flying sword doesn't belong to the sect. It's one that I obtained myself, and it's very powerful. I want only 500 talismans." Everyone started to talk about the sword amongst themselves for a while, and then someone walked forward and, without a word, handed over 500 talismans and finished the trade. Another began to say, "I have this piece of magical jade that could release a skill similar to Earth Split 3 times. I only want 10 chi gathering pills." He took out a piece of jade, waved it, and put it away. Someone not far from Wang Lin immediately said, "I'll exchange with you." As he was coming out, another person quickly said, "I'll trade 12 pills for that piece of jade." The first person hesitated and stared hard at the second person without a word. He felt that 10 pills were the limit. Soon after, people came up one by one, showing off their stuff, and the scene became lively, especially when people fought over a certain item. Whoever had the highest bid won. I have a technique here that, as long as you're above the second layer of chi condensation, you can use it to hide your cultivation for a short period of time, unless the person is already at the foundation establishment stage. I know that this thing is pretty useless. I only want 5 chi gathering pills for it. The person who said it was very hesitant. Everyone laughed. This technique really was useless. All of the disciples wanted to show off their cultivation because the higher the cultivation, the better their treatment. Who was that bored to want to hide their cultivation? If it lasted longer, then it would at least have some use, but it only lasted for a short period and cost so much, 5 chi gathering pills. Seeing that no one wanted it, the person sighed. Just as he was about to put it away, Wang Lin called out, "I'll trade 5 chi gathering pills for it." The person in the middle was stunned. They quickly became excited and came up to exchange. Holding the thing containing the technique, Wang Lin was stunned. He had never seen this type of thing before. He quickly scanned it with his divine sense, and the method of the technique quickly appeared in his mind. This thing might be useless for others, but it was very useful to him, even though it could only hide cultivation for a short period of time. A voice suddenly rang out. Despite it being hoarse, it was still filled with pride. "1 foundation establishment pill. State your offer." Wang Hao immediately became excited and quickly said, 20 chi gathering pills. 1,000 talismans plus a flying sword. 2,000 talismans. 30 chi gathering pills plus 500 talismans. A piece of skill jade, a flying sword, 10 chi gathering pills, and 500 talismans. The crowd loudly shouted their offers. They clearly viewed the foundation establishment pill as an item of great importance. Wang Lin had heard about this foundation establishment pill from Wang Hao. After taking the pill, its effect would stay in the body for 2 months. In those 2 months, The rate at which one absorbed spiritual energy would be increased by several times. It was something every disciple under the 7th layer of chi condensation desired. That pill was very precious, even in the sect. Every disciple normally only had 2 chances of obtaining it. When a disciple was promoted to black cloth rank, they could receive 1, and when they got promoted to purple cloth, they would receive 2. Thank you for listening to the light novel of Xianni, Renegade Immortal. Please help share, like, and subscribe for future uploads. I greatly appreciate your support.